Hello, my lovelies in U.S. history. We are going to now talk about a house divided. All right. Not a house dividing, a house divided. Just a quote that I have stolen from that famous Lincoln quote. A house divided cannot stand. And we are truly looking at the United States as a house divided. Follow me in our notes real quick and looking at this map. So you just have to look at your screen, right? So here are all of our states that allow the institution of slavery. And here is Missouri from that Missouri Compromise that it said, you know what? Slavery will never, ever exist above the southern boundary of Missouri from this point on. And then California enters into the Union, and it's weird because this is California. Is California going to be a slave state or a free state? We hit the Compromise of 1850. What does the South get for that? They get the power to send slave catchers from slave states into free territories, kidnapping folks and bringing them back into slavery. So you have all these political forces that are going to align and start saying, no, we're against, the expansion of slavery, that perhaps it is not the moral good that it had often been argued it was. Maybe we don't believe in paternalism. We don't think that the planters on these southern plantations are caring for these people, that, oh my gosh, they're being treated like property. And that's what was happening, okay? So here you even have a child spelling book from the 1850s from the Northern Abolitionist School, right? A is an abolitionist, a man who wants to free the wretched slave and give to all equal liberty. This is an issue that was splitting America apart, and we're going to look at it. All right. So what are the failings of the Compromise of 1850? Well, this political resolution, the fact that we're past the state level issue, does not stop the work of people who believe that slavery was wrong. And they want to keep slavery in the public conscience. They want people to pay attention to it. They want people to be exposed to it. And maybe, probably, no one did more to expose people to the horrors of slavery than this woman, who was an abolitionist named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she was an author. And she wrote a very famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, some of you have heard the word and term Uncle Tom, and it has taken on a meaning that is different than the meaning that it had 170 years ago. In the book, Uncle Tom was a Christ-like figure almost, who suffered the abuses of a terrible and cruel slave master named Simon Legree. Harriet Beecher Stowe is a writer. Let your English teacher judge her. But from a historical standpoint, Abraham Lincoln walked up to her and said, "You're the little lady that started this big war." Because what Uncle Tom's Cabin did is it kept the issue alive, and people were reading it all over the United States. I mean, it was in the year it was published, 1852, it was the most read book in the United States. And it kept it alive because all of the stories that people have been told, that the planters of the South are like gentry, they're like American royalty living on their castles, and that the people that are being held as slaves are treated like children, and that they are loved like members of the family. Well, that is thrown away in the face of the horrible violence and abuse that the plantation owner will place on the suffering figures of Uncle Tom and the other people that are held as slaves. Okay. And so when you get something into the public eye like that, then you start to foment a change in how people feel about the issue. And increasingly, people are going to feel like, slavery is a wrong thing. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin exposed people in the North, all right, to the worst realities in the South. They were shocked to learn the horrors of slavery. And because of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the issue moved into popular culture. It is no longer just an issue of the abolitionist. It is no longer just an issue of, Northern ministers. It is now something that people are talking about around the dinner table. And it's just not going to be pushed into the back corner of American reality. And nothing is going to do more to force it to the forefront of the breakfast table and of the office and people's discussions than the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Look, the idea of popular sovereignty had been put on the table during the Compromise of 1850. Instead of us fighting about this issue of slavery, why don't we just allow the people who live in a state to make this decision for themselves? This man's name is Stephen A. Douglas. He is one of the most famous politicians of the mid-19th century, and you've probably never heard of him. He is a congressman from the state of Illinois, and he is going to run, for president, and he is going to run for the Senate against Abraham Lincoln. Stephen Douglas is going to propose an act as a senator that is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it's going to give two territories, Nebraska and Kansas, right? Territorial governments, so that they have a group that can petition for their needs as they seek statehood. The whole reason behind that is this. Stephen Douglas is from Illinois, which is over here. Stephen Douglas wanted to build a railroad, all right? He wanted the federal government to do it so that you could connect Illinois and the businesses of Illinois and the canal systems that run through the Great Lakes to Buffalo, New York, to the Atlantic Ocean by railroad to this all of a sudden exploding, wealthy, important state of California. But the only way that the federal government would pay for a railroad is if it was with a state. They're not going to build a railroad across the wilderness. There has to be that federal relationship between the federal government, the national government, and the state government for that to happen. Okay? And so he wants to build a railroad. And there had to be states in place for the federal government to invest in the project. And there was no way that Illinois could pay to build railroads across the wilderness. All right? And so why is this an issue? Well, if Kansas and Nebraska are going to become a state, all right, slavery has to be addressed. And the act proposes that the issue of whether or not these new territories would be slave or free is settled through popular sovereignty. That means the status of slavery would be decided by a popular vote. You remember in our last class when we were talking about the Compromise of 1850 and how the idea of popular sovereignty ends the Missouri Compromise. Because if people can vote for slavery, slavery can exist anywhere in the United States. All right? Now, little did Stephen Douglas know that he was about to see the first real high-level bloodshed fought over the issue of slavery because of this act he proposes in the United States legislature. All right? And he will also help bring about the birth of a new political party. And this is the Republican Party. And this is the earliest beginnings of the Republican Party that exists today. Even though, like the Democratic Party, it has gone through many changes in beliefs and policies and that kind of thing. And so what's really happening is this. All of the new political factions of that time are going to join together in a complete realignment of American politics. And the initial realignment is going to be based off of the issue of slavery. Free, not free. North, south. Okay? And it only takes a few years for the Republican Party to functionally erase the Whig Party. That was the other major party that competed against the Democrats. Okay? So in the Republican Party, what you got was this. You got Northern Whigs, all right, that Whig Party that had been created to counter Andrew Jackson's Democrats, all right? You got these abolitionists who are people that wanted to do anything to end the institution of slavery. You got Northern Democrats. They are part of the Democratic Party. They are part of the party of Jackson, the common men, but they work in factory jobs and they don't want to compete against the institution of slavery. And perhaps because of things like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, they believe that slavery is wrong. And you have free soilers, all right? These free soilers that didn't want to see slavery expand into new territories out west. The nativists who are anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. They're Protestant people because they believe that America is a Protestant Christian country, not a Catholic Christian country. And all of these new immigrants that are showing up, like the Italians and the Irish, are Catholics. The know-nothings. All these different people are going to come together and unite behind a single desire, which is to stop seeing slavery expand. And they will become Republicans, and they will campaign on it. Fremont, Dayton, and free Kansas. They will fight for the idea that the goal of this party is to make sure that Kansas votes to be a free state. So, popular sovereignty, the vote, and the issue of slavery lead to a furtherance of this old term of sectionalism. All right? And this new version of sectionalism is the Democrats, the South, slavery, states' rights. That's one party. And the Republicans, the North, and the non-expansion of slavery. There can be all types of other varieties of things with that, but the Republicans were united by being really in the North and believing that slavery should not be expanded, okay? And they made this issue the entire platform of how they were competing. And if you look at this old flyer, and yes, I know it is racist, and yes, I realize all the things that are problematic with that. Well, guess what? So did they at that time. And they didn't make any bones about this. They said, look, the Democratic platform is for the white man, and the Republican platform, well, it is not, okay? And so don't make any mistake. These are almost single issue politics as we are heading towards 1860, okay? Now, what's going on in the White House while we're heading towards this penultimate election of Abraham Lincoln that changes the direction of the United States? Well, we have all of these weak presidents that I've already told you about, all right? These weak, sad presidents that are just, what makes them so bad? It's really just they're not addressing the crisis that is going on. One of the things that defines presidents, it's not what happens while they're president, it's how they react to it. So, nobody looks back at FDR and says, oh my God, during FDR's presidency, hundreds of thousands of people died, World War II, or, nobody looks back and says that. They look back and go, FDR, man, he helped us conquer the Great Depression. They don't look at the fact that some of the worst unemployment in the history of the United States happened during his presidency for years and years and years. They don't remember that. It's how you respond to the crisis. And these three men, Franklin Pierce, Millard Fillmore, and James Buchanan, they do not respond to the conflicts and crisis. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act and this idea of popular sovereignty was painting the coming crisis clearly on the national agenda, and they did nothing. And it's going to come to bloodshed, all right? And they will call this crisis Bleeding Kansas because it is going to be done by popular vote, right? Beside Kansas is Missouri. You remember the Missouri Compromise. Missouri is a slave state. Kansas is flooded with pro-slavery people from Missouri who want to make sure that Kansas also votes for Missouri. Also votes for slavery, so that Missouri and Kansas are strengthening each other. So you got all these people in Missouri that already has slavery that are just hopping over the border and saying, hey, I'm building a cabin, we're going to have slavery here, and I'm going to vote, okay? And they're coming, you might see, armed with guns and swords and, whatever. These look like Civil War pictures. You know it? They do. You know why? Because people are taking their pictures with their guns because it's probably the only picture that they ever had taken of them. And they want to make sure that there is a way for people to remember that they went off to fight for what they believed in, and they believed in slavery. These men are called the Border Ruffians. They are pro-slavery Missourians who would hop over the border into Kansas to vote for slavery, all right? And so these pro-slavery Missourians flood the polls in support of Kansas allowing slavery. Now, you might say, like, oh my gosh, this doesn't sound like a fair election. Well, it wasn't. More people voted in this election than actually lived in Kansas. All right. If you look at the pictures that I have down here, they would actually take people across from Missouri on rafts, carry them in wagons to vote, and then float them down the river to the next town and have a wagon there to carry them to vote and move them down the river, have them vote over and over again. You had polls that were giving everybody that voted for slavery a free shot of whiskey, okay? A free shot of whiskey. And so you would go get your shot of whiskey, and it says down with the abolitionists right down there in that sign, right? You get your shot of whiskey, you vote for slavery, and then you get in the back of the line and you go through the line again, get another shot and vote again. I mean, this is, one of the most corrupt elections in the history of the United States. So what's going to be the result? Well, it's completely skewed by these conservative pro-slavery forces, and the pro-slavery forces were victorious in the vote through trick, through crime, through whatever. All right, so they're victorious. So they actually set up two alternate governments. All right, and the people who are homesteaders, who are moving out to start farms and that kind of stuff, they set up an anti-slavery government, like a Democratic government, in a place called Lawrence, Kansas. All right, and so there's going to be a result. All of these pro-slavery Missourians who had moved into Kansas to make sure that Kansas has slavery, are going to be incensed, and they're going to petition these weak presidents in the federal government to recognize the fact that they won the election. And so all the homesteaders out there say, look, they're not even from the state. They're not even living here. The federal government, under these awful presidents, recognizes the illegitimate pro-slavery government of Kansas, even though everyone in America knew that they had cheated in the election. Okay. And they says, no, well, too bad. This is going to be Kansas's government here, and it's going to be pro-slavery. And so the idea of, this, election being stolen meant that these armed slavers are against the abolitionists, this new Republican ideas, these nativists, the free soilers and stuff. They're going to have sporadic civil war that's going to last for years. And they're going to actively fight against each other and get into gunfights and kill each other all over the issue of slavery. In other words, the fact that, listen, anytime something gets so contentious that people are taken to the streets of the country with firearms to fight about it, I mean, you are flirting with civil war. Well, this is a low-grade civil war. And that's why they called it Bleeding Kansas, because the people out there were bleeding. They were dying over the issue of slavery. Okay? So how do people in the rest of the United States react to what's going on in Kansas? Well, a senator from Massachusetts is going to stand up. Okay? His name is Charles Sumner, and he is going to stand up in front of the Senate, and he's going to say, the crime in Kansas cannot stand. They stole the government, et cetera, et cetera. And the congressman from South Carolina named Charles Sumner is going to stand up and walk across the room and is going to mercilessly beat him with a cane. Okay? Beat him in the head with a cane to the point that he was at a risk of dying. And Southerners, with outrage, Northerners with outrage are going to respond, and Southerners from all over the slave states are going to mail canes to the Senate office, carved, hit him again, saying that they are willing for violence to be done on behalf of slavery. All right. And so this anti-slavery government that had been set up in Lawrence, Kansas, is burned to the ground by pro-slavery forces. So I want you to step back and think about what's going on. Elected officials are violently assaulting each other in our legislature. All right. People are getting into gunfights over the issue of slavery. And a town, a functioning government town that most people recognize by population, the North had way more people, is the legitimate government of a territory that wants to become a new state, the state of Kansas, is torched by militia. well-armed militia. These with guns that are burning down the city. This is chaos, and we all know what's getting ready to happen. What's getting ready to happen is the deadliest war in the history of the United States. So, who's going to spark that war? Well, there's one man out in Kansas that wants to be the one who starts it. Okay, and that man's name is John Brown. This is John Brown. I think he is one of the more interesting figures in American history. All right. I was taught that John Brown was a madman when I was a kid. And I'm not convinced that that is true. All right. I think he was a zealot, and I think he was intense, and I think that he was willing to kill if he was killing for what he thought was a cause that was a right cause. And John Brown is going to try to start the Civil War by committing something called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. All right? Remember them that are in bonds as if you are bound with them. That's what he tells his children. When they would walk into religious services, he would stand up black parishioners in the backs of the churches where, these meetings, these religious meetings of abolitionists would still be segregated. I mean, just because people thought slavery was wrong didn't mean they weren't racist. John Brown was an anti-racist in the 1850s. He would stand up those black families and he would walk them to the front of the church and seat them. And he would call them Mr. and Mrs. and say, you deserve this place of honor. And him and his children would go sit in the back on the floor. And he looked out and he had heard that, he was a radical. And he had heard that there were threats being placed towards his family and his son because he spoke against the institution of slavery. And he went further. He spoke against racism. And so when, he heard about Lawrenceville, he felt like him living in Kansas with all of his sons, and he had a bunch of children, were being threatened. And so in reaction to the sacking of Lawrence, he heard a rumor that a bunch of those border ruffians, the pro-slavery men who lived in Kansas, had said that they were going to kill John Brown and kill his sons. And he will put together his own small army of radical abolitionists, his own militia, to fight back. Okay? And with this militia, having heard the threats that were being placed towards him and his sons, on one night, John Brown and his group of abolitionists took 5 pro-slavery men out of their cabins at night. They went and knocked on their doors, and when the men came to the doors, they took them out and they led them to the edges of their property, and they slaughtered them with broadswords. They did it in a bloody and public way. And they did it in an attempt to begin a civil war, to end slavery. Feeling like every person in America that had morals and Christian values would then rise up against the South, that like Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, that the men held as slaves, would take up their farming implements and they would begin fighting for freedom. So John Brown is like Andrew Jackson and Nat Turner. He is complicated. He woke men up out of their beds and he killed them in their front yards with a sword, right? So some people, when they think about John Brown, the argument is this: is he a madman? Is he a killer? Or is there such thing as a good terrorist? Now, this is a debate, and I am setting you up to have to think about these things, these conflicted figures in the history of the United States. Not black or white, not good or evil, not chaotic or orderly, but complicated. We're going to see John Brown again later, okay? So here is John Brown and Bleeding, Kansas. All of America heard about what happened out in Bleeding, Kansas. And in 1856, the Republicans won 11 of the 16 free states. Now, you look at those electoral college numbers. Texas, huge place, only has 4 electoral college votes because nobody lived there. But New York has 35. Pennsylvania has 27. Ohio has 23. Okay? The Republicans are gaining serious ground 11 of the 16 states. Okay. So what does that mean? What does that mean for presidential politics? It means that that the Republicans are a contender for the White House. Now, do they win the White House? No, because some of the free states are going to go to James Buchanan. James Buchanan, the Democratic candidate, is going to win the White House. Many people say that he is number one or number two for being the worst president in the history of the United States. But his election is going to mark a permanent transition for the Republican Party. They are no longer going to be ignored. The Republican Party will now replace the Whig Party, and it will be the Democrats versus the Republicans competing in America's two-party system. All right? So what does James Buchanan do? Now that he is facing incredible crisis over the issue of slavery, there's people being killed with swords in ditches, there's low-level civil war, there's stolen elections, there's fake governments, there's cities being burned down. Surely he will step in and he will act in this crisis. But he doesn't really, okay? The crisis only gets deeper. This is Dred Scott, all right? And we will need to learn about the Dred Scott case. I have no idea what's going on up there with that writing. 1857. In 1857, a slave named Dred Scott, and every once in a while you see his name spelled with one T, all right? Dred Scott was transported by his master from Kentucky, which is a state that allows slavery, to live in Illinois and in Wisconsin. These are free territories. Slavery is not allowed in Illinois, and slavery is not allowed in Wisconsin. All right? So what does he do? Well, he went to court. He says, look, I was carried into an area, right, here, right, that slavery is against the law. All right? He wants to sue for his freedom. He says, if slavery was illegal, it means that I am free because I have lived in places that slavery cannot exist. This is his court case, right? Dred Scott. You know, I mean, what is the answer? That's why the court exists. You remember when we go back to John Marshall, right? To settle issues over, laws that affect the whole country and issues where states don't agree. Kentucky would say that slavery is an institution from birth. Illinois and Wisconsin say that it cannot exist. All right. This case is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and it is going to be decided by Chief Justice Robert B. Taney in one of the worst decisions in the history of the United States. So again, I bring up this idea that just because something is legal sometimes does not make it moral. And I hope as citizens you remember this. That's why you have to participate in your government. The court decides in the favor of slavery. And that could have been enough. They could have said, Dred Scott, you're not free. I'm sorry, you were a slave, and that's it. Okay? And reduced him in that way. But Roger Taney thought he was going to go further. He was one of those activist judges, and he is going to try to settle the issue of slavery. And so he gives a 3-part ruling. Part 1. Roger Taney says that he believes that, and this is his quote, that blacks had no rights which a white man has to respect. You cannot be a citizen, okay? There is no way for you to be a citizen, and if you're not a citizen, guess what? That means that you cannot come to the court. He says that Dred Scott remains a slave and a property, and that the right of property owners are more important than state laws. And so if you are carrying your private property into an area that didn't allow it, well, that state does not have a right to take your property from you. In other words, because people who are black cannot be citizens, in other words, because they are a property, it's not the same. How can a property petition the court? And I know this sounds awful. Well, guess what? It is, again, probably the worst decision in the history of America's Supreme Court. It says that Congress could not prevent free men from transporting private property. Now, I want to see if you're thinking through this logic chain. If there are no rights for people who are black, and if Dred Scott was a property, and that Congress and state governments cannot prevent people from transporting private property, well, doesn't that mean that slavery exists everywhere as long as slave owners carry people who are held as slaves to that place? It does. And that's a whole new crisis. All right. So when Roger Taney, and this is a little review, is reviewing these laws to make a decision, does anybody remember what power of the Supreme Court that John Marshall helped create that he uses to review these other laws? You're right. It is called judicial review. That's a good reminder. But that's not the issue at hand. The issue at hand is that Roger Taney and the Supreme Court tried to make sure that slavery existed everywhere. Surely, in a system of checks and balances, the President of the United States will step in and put a stop to this. But President Buchanan used his State of the Union address to announce that because of the ruling, slavery now exists in all territories by virtue of the Constitution. Well, guess what? A lot of the people that we've been learning about are not going to agree with James Buchanan, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Theodore Weld, the Grimke's. And guess what? There's going to be a fight over this issue of slavery. Over the issue of slavery, you see that America is now completely divided. I'll see you next week for our next step in our walk towards the Civil War.